Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and today for a special Oscar-themed episode of the show, we have with us our resident film guru, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
So that's my latest title. I'm resident film guru.
We're trying to come up with inventive titles for each of the intros. So
no, that's okay.
We got to get creative.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, but we both woke up to sort of disturbing news this morning. I guess it was a long time coming, but finally today we got the announcement that the great Billy Graham has passed away. Billy Graham was known as America's pastor. He was born in 1918, died in 2018. He was 99 years old, probably best known for his Billy Graham crusades around the world, where he preached to over 200 million people, ministered to 12 presidents. Maybe later on we'll do a longer discussion about Billy Graham, but Bishop, what are some of your immediate thoughts about this death of this great man?
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly one of the greatest, if not the greatest evangelist of the last 100 years. So one of the most significant Christians on the planet. Maybe some of the younger folks don't remember him because he's been kind of out of, the public eye for the past maybe 20 years. But gosh, for most of the 20th century, I mean, he was a major player, maybe the most recognizable Christian in the world. And I think a man that was very admired for his integrity of life. When so many preachers of the gospel got into trouble or were compromised in some ways, Billy Graham had this very consistent dedication to the gospel and moral integrity, et cetera. And I think people really admired him for that. And then I think for the quality and clarity and simplicity and directness and obvious sincerity of his preaching. So go on YouTube. You can find all sorts of examples of his preaching in his prime. Get a crusade from the 60s or 70s or something. And you'll see a really great preacher at work. And maybe in a later show, as you say, we could look into what made his preaching so compelling. But this morning, I got the news early this morning, right after I woke up out here in California, and I went to my chapel for my holy hour, and I prayed very fervently for Billy Graham, who had a big impact on me in many ways.
Billy Graham's probably the most famous graduate of Wheaton College, which is an evangelical college there right outside of Chicago, where you were for most of your life. And they have this beautiful museum, the Billy Graham Center, which highlights some of the major moments and activities of his life. You visited that center and, from what I understand, emerged from it with a couple of key principles that even to this day you count as central to your work. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think I went there with Father Steve, who now runs Word on Fire day to day. We went there, probably 20 years ago, right around the beginning of Word on Fire. And I think I was just impressed by the role played by this individual. And evangelization is not an abstraction. It's got to be something that's concretized and that gathers itself around an evangelist, And so we kind of came to that conclusion that if we're going to do this, I've got to give myself to it. I've got to, put myself forward as someone willing to take up this task. That otherwise it's a velleity. Otherwise it's an abstraction. And so it was the concrete dedication of Billy Graham that had a big impact on me that day.
There was also a funny anecdote that after visiting this museum and talking about Billy Graham and thinking through what this new Word on Fire ministry would look like, you got in front of the board and you told them something funny. Tell me about that. We were talking about it here before we started recording. I wanted to make sure everyone else got to hear it too.
Oh, was that about the sort of the practicalities of it? In Billy Graham's great autobiography, he said at the very beginning of his evangelistic career, he intuited that there were three things that tend to undermine evangelists, and that's scandals around sex, around alcohol, and around money, right? So when I had just read the book and our board was just kind of getting going, and so I said, well, I think Billy Graham's right about that. I said, now, I'll have to take care of the sex and alcohol side. Could you take care of the money side for me? and to this day, we go back to that I tell my board, I want you to be really monitoring this carefully. And, so we set things up in many ways in imitation of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which I admired.
Well, I encourage everybody to say a quick prayer for the soul of Billy Graham. He was a great man. And again, we're hoping to do much more on him and his legacy on a future episode. Today, though, we are talking about several movies that have been nominated for the Best Picture Award in the Academy Awards. Just a quick warning here before we get into some of these films. This episode will likely contain spoilers, so we're not going to offer a warning each time we offer a spoiler. So if you haven't seen any of these and you want to see them before hearing any commentary, you might want to pause this and come back later. There were 9 films nominated for the Best Picture Award. We're going to cover 7 of them here, the 7 that Bishop Barron has seen. He hasn't seen Call Me By Your Name or Phantom Thread, but we're going to discuss the other 7. So, Bishop, let's just go through rapid fire each of these and talk about some of your reactions to each of them and maybe some of the interesting religious or spiritual themes you noticed in them as well. So first of all is Dunkirk. This was directed by Christopher Nolan. It's a sort of historical psychological drama set amid World War II and the evacuation of the Allied soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk in France. It's an interesting movie because it's a sensory, almost experimental movie with not a lot of dialogue. It's kind of eerily silent. You're just sort of taking in the emotions and the settings of this dramatic event. What were your initial impressions of Dunkirk?
Yeah, I liked it. I like war movies. I like movies about World War II. And of course, Dunkirk is a very interesting moment in the history of World War II. And, you know, it's that calling forth of the ordinary person to get involved in all these pleasure boats and commercial boats that made their way across the English Channel to rescue the British Army. So it was kind of a stirring movie. I think it was well made. I don't know if it stayed honestly in my imagination that long. You know, I did like it, and I thought it was a theme worth exploring, but it didn't. I don't know. It didn't grab me at a deeper level the way some of the, let's say, Saving Private Ryan or some of the really great World War II movies do. That's a quick reaction.
When the film opens, there's sort of this chaotic moment where you're following the soldier through the streets, and then he makes his way to the beach. He's trying to wrap his head around the situation, and then he sees a man wounded in the sand. He's near death, and immediately you see the gears turning in his mind. Like, what should I do? You know, do I need to help this guy? He finally summons the courage to pick him up, and he's carrying him across the beach as bombs are going off, and you're thinking, this is a totally pointless pursuit. I mean, these guys are probably going to get bombed. You know, there's savage medical needs all over the place, yet he decides to carry this man all the way and finally makes it to the medical boat to save him. And for me, that sort of summed up the theme of this movie, that these major big events like war really hinges on the accumulation of the much smaller moral decisions and acts of virtue. This guy carrying the wounded soldier, these small individual boats carrying 20, 30 soldiers across the channel. What do you think is the big takeaway from a film like Dunkirk?
No, I think that's right. I mean, these moves of kind of quiet heroism and the Mark Rylance, the great actor who is sort of the focus of the movie in terms of the civilians who are rescuing the soldiers. I think that's what they're focusing on, is this sort of quiet heroism and people that make these really life and death decisions, but on a very, very small scale, so they wouldn't be noticed by the historians. But I think, yeah, that's what he was interested in showing us in this movie.
Okay, let's turn to a film that I know you liked a whole lot more. It's the second film that takes place in England during World War II. It's called Darkest Hour. It's a British war drama starring Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill, and it covers his earliest days as prime minister as Nazi Germany is sweeping across Western Europe. First of all, why do you think there's just this insatiable interest in World War II films? There's no, Civil War films that get the same acclaim, not many World War I films. Why this war? Why does it draw, even today, so much interest?
Well, I think as the moral values are so clear, it's kind of a good versus evil. There's a clarity about things. And then a figure like Churchill, who's, of kind of world historical importance, and he's played here by, as you say, the great Gary Oldman. The only distraction for me, I love Gary Oldman. He's one of my favorite actors. And one of my favorite movies is from years ago, is Bram Stoker's Dracula, where he plays in certain scenes the very old Dracula. And at times his Churchill makeup and Gary Oldman's face reminded me of the old Dracula. So that was a little distracting. But here's what I liked the most about that movie, what I thought about the most. This key moment when Hitler is, rampaging his way through Europe. And there were very, very smart, responsible, morally upright people. It's not bad guys at all in England who were saying, the best course here is let's make a deal here. Let's make a compromise. Let Hitler have Europe and we'll make a deal and he'll leave us alone. And again, mind you, these are not bad people. And Churchill, comes on the scene. And what I like maybe best in the movie is that you really see he was tempted a bit. He was considering this possibility of, yes, let's make a compromise. But then he sees with clarity, summons the courage, and says, no, we have to fight. And all the wonderful, speeches. And see, what kept going through my mind was this. Good, decent, upright people were saying it's probably best to compromise with Hitler. And let's say England had cut a deal. Well, what would have happened is Hitler would have controlled Europe. He would have controlled France, the Low Countries. He would have controlled all of Central Europe, and he would have been free to invade Russia, which is really his goal all along. All the time setting up these dreadful death camps, which would have been unchallenged, right? Because if England didn't get in the war, likely we wouldn't have gotten in the war against Hitler. So that moment when you have to decide, am I dealing with an evil so profound that it has to be opposed, and saying all we can and should say about compromise and about nonviolence and all those good things. And I affirm all of that. Nevertheless, there are times when you have to summon the courage and you have to have the clarity of vision to say, no, this evil has to be fought now with all we've got. And that was arguably the hinge moment of the 20th century. When this older man, Churchill was no kid. He'd been around for a long time. He was widely disliked in the British government establishment. He was seen as kind of a, outlier. That he had the vision and he had the courage to do what had to be done. And so much of our history, in a positive way, hinged on that moment. And so I think that's a cool thing to think about. Now, it takes a lot of prudence and wisdom and courage to get that, to be at that moment. But what are we going to do, as we face these tricky, challenging situations? That's what I like best about Darkest Hour.
We might find an analogy between Churchill in this episode and the stories of the Old Testament, where there's a constant struggle. The Israelites always seem to want to compromise or capitulate to evil. Like, let's banish evil mostly, but not all the way. And then that has deep ramifications. You've talked about the Agag story, right, in the Old Testament.
Hacking him to pieces was the needful thing. So anyway, I thought that was interesting in that movie.
Was this your favorite Churchill depiction, or how does it rank up there?
I don't know. I'm a big Churchill fan. Read a lot of the biographies. I liked very much was John Lithgow's performance in The Crown. That wonderful series on Netflix about Queen Elizabeth. And Lithgow, of course, is an American. You wouldn't think naturally would get Churchill, but I thought he was wonderful as Churchill in that.
Okay, next up, we'll talk about Get Out. This is a horror film about a black man who uncovers a disturbing secret when he meets the family of his white girlfriend. Surprisingly, this film has earned a ton of Academy attention. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor. What was this film about, and what'd you think about it, Bishop?
Yeah, I liked it. I didn't see it in the theater, but it's been on cable now, and I've seen parts of it, and a number of times. Well, I think it's about this original sin of the American culture, which is our racism and the relationship between the dominant culture and minority cultures, especially here, African Americans, and the strange sort of symbiosis that has taken place. I don't want to give maybe too much of the movie away, but it's about, I think, the dominant white culture, both fascinated by and repelled by the African-American culture, a fascination, a desire to get into the black experience. And at the same time, a sort of master-slave dynamic that still holds sway. See, and there it's very interesting, as I use that term master-slave from Hegel, because a lot of people, up to and including many in our early 21st century, have reflected on that. the very subtle and complex dynamic between master and slave, where the master needs the slave needs the master, and there's a kind of weird, not altogether healthy symbiosis between the two. And I think Get Out is exploring that dynamic. How Black people feel vis-a-vis the dominant white culture, even a white culture that seems, at least on the surface, to be very agreeable and to be kind of enlightened, liberal, how do they relate to that culture? How does that culture relate to them? That's what the movie explores. From a filmmaking standpoint, I think it's quite good. It's got a sort of Hitchcockian quality. It's a slowly building suspense sort of movie. What's exactly going on? It's not clear till really the very end. So it draws you in. And the acting, I think, is quite fine. But it's the thematics of it, the philosophical reflections on the sort of master-slave dynamic and this dynamic within our culture between Black and white that's really compelling in this movie.
All right, let's talk about Lady Bird. We've talked about this a little on past episodes of the show. I know it's one you really like. Lady Bird is kind of a quirky coming-of-age comedy drama. It's written and directed by Greta Gerwig, and it features a character named Christine Lady Bird McPherson. That's her self-given nickname. She's a senior at a Catholic high school in Sacramento, but she longs to attend an Ivy League college somewhere across the country in a city with much more culture and more interesting things going on. It's a film with a lot of tension between this high schooler and her family and her friends and boyfriends, etc. What did you think of the film, and what were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, I liked it. And I wrote a column. I think we did a video on Lady Bird. I liked it as a movie. I thought it was funny. I thought it was very well acted. It was engaging. And I liked it right away, but then when I read some of the commentary by the director, by Greta Gerwig, I was even more intrigued because it's very autobiographical. She herself, not a Catholic, but she attended a Catholic high school. And she said, look, I could have made a movie making fun of Catholic high schools. That's been done a million times. But she said, something happened to me in Catholic high school that was really life-giving. And that's what the movie's about, I think, is something that this young lady took in her Catholic formation that at a key moment in her life constituted a breakthrough of grace. And, all the usual teen tensions with parents and with friends and, who's in and who's out and romantic difficulties and all of that teen angst going on. But then there's this moment of grace at the end where I think she gets something. And then something else that Gerwig mentioned in her interview that I thought was really intriguing. And I've actually preached on it now a couple of times. She said, I've always been intrigued by this consideration. What were the saints like when they were teenagers? So we think of the saints, St. Thomas Aquinas, and there's St. Augustine, and they're up in stained glass windows in churches looking full of maturity and full of, their spiritual integrity and everything else. Okay, yeah, reached that point. But Teresa of Avila was once a teenager. Thomas Aquinas was once a teenager. Augustine, in fact, we hear about his teenage years in the Confessions, told pretty frankly. What were they like when they were teenagers? And, experiencing all the usual tensions and difficulties. And then what was it that broke through, Now, God knows I'm not a saint, believe me, but as I think of my own life, when I was a teenager, I had that experience of hearing about St. Thomas Aquinas. And that was a life reconfiguring thing for me. And I think she's quite rightly intrigued by that moment. And she sees Lady Bird, I think, as, well, maybe someone that would grow into a saint in time. And there was something actually in her Catholic formation that allowed that to happen. So I thought that was really interesting and worth thinking about.
One of the dynamics that struck me was this back and forth between self-invention or discovering your identity. So at the beginning of the film, Lady Bird, someone asks her about her name, Lady Bird, and she says something like, that's my name, that's the name I gave myself, rather than the name I was given. And throughout the film, there's this tension where she's trying to create and invent the person she wants to be instead of taking cues from her family, her friends, the culture around her. You've said that this self-expressionism, this self-invention, tends to be one of the major blocks keeping people back from faith today. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and see, it's a very interesting tension because it doesn't mean, oh, that means I guess I'm just heteronomous. Like that the outside world and God and society, they just totally define who I am. But that's not the right way to think about it. Rather, it's what they call theonomy, right? That God becomes the nomos, the law of my life. And when that happens, I do indeed find who I am. And so there's something right in the instinct to say, yeah, I want to discover my own identity. Good. Look at Peter and Paul. Look at Jacob. Look at all the great figures in the Bible who are, talk about themselves. I mean, they have their own very distinctive personalities, and they find them precisely through the theonomous surrender to God. That's what's interesting. It's neither autonomy nor heteronomy. See, our culture, that's deep in our cultural DNA. We don't like heteronomy. Don't tread on me. Don't you tell me what to do. I don't want some outside force. And I get that. Because they're as corrupt as anybody else. But when God tells you who you are, now it's the best of your autonomy, but without all of the self-deception in usual autonomy. It's my life. That's the subtle place you have to inhabit.
Next up is The Post. This is a film directed and produced by Steven Spielberg. It stars Meryl Streep as Katharine Graham, who is the first female publisher of a major American newspaper, The Washington Post, hence the title, The Post. The film's set in the 1970s, and it depicts the true story of journalists to publish the Pentagon Papers, which were classified documents regarding the United States government's involvement in the Vietnam War. Bishop, you didn't like this one so much, did you?
Well, I should qualify that. Look at Steven Spielberg is a master filmmaker, and all of his touches are there. There are some very fine actors in this movie, and it actually reminded me. See, that period, late 60s, early 70s, it's right when I was about 10, 11 years old. And I was just becoming aware of the kind of wider culture. So I remember that time a bit. So, and it was a watchable movie. I'd say this, by the end of the movie, I was finding it really tiresome. Now, why? Well, it was an attempt, I think, to revive All the President's Men, which really is a great movie, and about the heroic journalists who, speak truth to power, and they stand up to the man, and they uncover this corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So you got something going on here where now it's the issue of, do we have a right to publish the Pentagon Papers? And the counter argument, of course, was that publishing these papers was deleterious to the country and to our efforts in Vietnam. So there was a case against it, that it would really harm the nation. To me, by the end, this movie got so heavy-handed of the virtue of the press, these kind of untrammeled heroes who were just devoted to the common good, standing up against the man, and it got so heavy-handed to me. I saw it with Father Steve, and I kept turning to him, and I said, yeah, but who's watching them? See, because they kept saying, we're here to watch the man, we're here to watch the government, we're keeping an eye on corruption. Yeah, okay, but who's keeping an eye on you? I'm not quite so willing to say, oh yeah, the journalists, they're clearly all saints, and they're nothing but interested in the common good. Come on. We've got a healthy system of checks and balances, and someone's got to check the press too. And I just found it was too Capra-esque by the end. It was like this very almost corny, one-sided affirmation of the press. So anyway, I found it just too much. It lacked the subtlety, I think, that was called for.
Next up is The Shape of Water. This is a drama film by the imaginative director Guillermo del Toro. It's set in Baltimore, 1962, kind of during the Cold War period. And the plot follows a mute custodian at a high-security government lab who falls in love with a captured fish, some sort of humanoid amphibian creature. Yeah, you say that this one kind of annoyed you. Tell us about that.
Oh, I hated it. Here's the thing, and I'll have to give away some of it, but who's the bad guy in this movie? And this comes up so often in Hollywood movies today. Who's the bad guy? Of course, it's a Christian. Of course, it's someone who cites the Bible. And he's a jerk too. He's hypocritical and he's cruel and he's secretly doing the very things he hates. So it's a typical kind of liberal Hollywood take on the Christian, who's the bad guy. The story revolves, as you say, around this woman who works in this government, agency or government lab where this creature is, and he's kind of a half fish, half human creature they found. And long story short, she falls in love with this creature, and then she has sexual relations with the creature. And what's very, very clear is that that's just great. And anyone that thinks otherwise is just being, a hung up, old fashioned, as long as their relations are consensual, it's just great. And so I thought that in some ways the Aquaman was a stand-in for any and all forms of transgressive sexuality. And the Christian, the bad guy, see, he's cruel and hypocritical bad guy who wouldn't be for this sort of thing. It's a typical black, white, simplistic take. The biblical view is that sex is more than just something that consenting adults do. It's a form of entertainment that's entered into by consenting adults, that it's part of a much wider framework of meaning. And that something like trans species sexuality would be a little bit on the problematic side, And so I just think it's Hollywood pressing this agenda of, the transgressive is okay as long as you got consenting adults involved. And don't let these hung up, angry, hypocritical Christians get in your way. Now, maybe I'm overstating things a bit, but that's how I received that movie. I found it very, very heavy-handed and simplistic.
Well, let's close here with a film that I think you like a little bit better, at least. It's called Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. It was written, produced, and directed by Martin McDonagh, and it stars Frances McDormand, who plays a mother who rents these 3 billboards to call attention to her daughter's unsolved murder. You've described this film as Flannery O'Connor without the grace. Why is that?
Yeah, and it's a movie I did like a lot. I think it's very well made. I love Frances McDormand, one of my favorite actresses. Go back to Fargo, which is one of my favorite movies of the last 25 years, and she's the great hero of Fargo. And whenever she's in a movie, she's one of those actors who's just watchable, So she's great. And the movie begins with one of the characters. He's got his feet up on the desk, and he's reading A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, and it's clearly indicated. So I thought, okay, they're announcing their intentions right away to do something in the Flannery mode, which indeed they do. I would say the characters, the strange plot twists, the dark humor, all of that is very Flannery O'Connor-esque. But it was missing, as far as I could tell, what you always find in Flannery is in and through all of this business, there's going to be the breakthrough of grace. But we're living at a time, especially in the Hollywood sort of culture, when grace and God talk is just very hard for people. At the best, something like a moral sense, might be at play. I don't want to give too much away, but it had all the trappings, and that's no small thing. That's a great thing. All the trappings of Flannery O'Connor. But I was missing the spiritual heart of it, the moment of redemption. Now, mind you, in Flannery, she says, my stories are about the offer of grace, usually refused. And so don't think that they're all going to come to some really happy ending. But there's a clear breakthrough of a transcendent offer of grace. I didn't see that in this movie. Good, involving, well acted, interesting. I like the kind of dark humor thing. But I think we should go back to the drawing board and read more Flannery O'Connor with the religious sensibility in place. Let's get a good Catholic filmmaker to make this movie, but with more of the Flannery O'Connor substance in it. I think would be a really great movie.
All right. Well, here's the big question. What is Bishop Barron's best film of 2017?
Well, it's funny. I didn't think about it till just now going through all these. And again, there are 2 that I've not seen of the 9. But of the ones we talked about, Lady Bird would be my favorite of these. And I do think, objectively, the finest movie all the way around. Next up, I would say probably the Three Billboards from just a film standpoint. I think Get Out, maybe number 3, something like that. I would say are the finest movies of the ones we've looked at.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. We love hearing from you guys. So if you have a question you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, just visit askbishopbarron.com, record your question, and perhaps we'll choose it here for one of our episodes. Today we hear from Reese from Vancouver, Canada, who asks about free will. Here's Reese.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Reese, and I'm from Vancouver, Canada. My question is, how essential is the concept of free will to Christianity? I am thinking about divergent interpretations of free will that have flowed from the Reformation, especially Calvinism. I personally have questioned whether these can even fall under the branch of Christianity. What actually defines someone as a Christian? Thank you for all the work you do at Word on Fire.
Yeah, it's a good searching question. I put my philosopher's hat back on for that one. I would say it's essential to Christianity because you're dealing in Christianity, to use Balthazar's language, with a theodrama. And a drama is a play of freedoms. It's a play of divine freedom and human freedom. It's not just a puppet show. It's a play of real agents, namely God and human beings. And God making an offer of grace that has to be accepted in freedom. And everything in the spiritual life hinges upon that, from the beginnings of spiritual life all the way through the consummation in heaven. It's a question of a play of freedom. So I'd say essential. Now, I know what you're driving at with the reformers. We'd have to do a whole, course to look into that adequately. But a text like Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will comes to mind, where Luther lays out a pretty radical position on free will, namely denying it. So Luther would say, look, you're either ridden by God or by the devil. And there really isn't what is classically known as free will. A somewhat more mitigated version in Calvin. And again, we need a whole course to deal with this adequately, but I would say those are problematic views as far as I'm concerned. That's why someone like von Balthasar, in his great trilogy, which includes the Glory of the Lord, that's dealing with beauty, it includes the Theologic, dealing with the mind, but then in the middle of it, the heart of the triptych is the Theodramatique, the theodrama, the play of freedoms. And that was an answer, all three are actually, an answer to Luther, an answer to the Reformation. So I would say yes, from a Catholic perspective, we can deal, I think, a bit better with that question.
Well, thanks for that question, Reese, and thank you for listening to this Oscar-inspired episode of the Word on Fire show. We have an exciting announcement. We try to have an exciting announcement at the end of every episode, but today we got a new one. We just launched the website for a new conference that we're hosting at Word on Fire for priests. It's a national conference for priests, and the topic will be on preaching. This summer, we're inviting priests to join Bishop Barron and the Word on Fire team in California for 2.5 days of strengthening our preaching. So if that sounds interesting to you, if you're a priest, go to wordonfireshow.com/priest to learn more. If you're not a priest, please share this with your pastor, any priest friends you have, and encourage them to attend. Again, all the information is at wordonfireshow.com/priest. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.